The first thing I want to do is say a couple of thank yous to Emily and to Joan for the invitation. It's just really wonderful to be here. And while I'd rather physically be in LA for the occasion, I am happy to be on the edge of a continent that looks remarkably like this, but without this installation. And I was really struck by the Making Waves website and the links because they represent, the objects represent a very direct kind of rhetorical intervention in a kind of crisis that affects us all, whether we are on the coasts or even on the interior of the country, anywhere in the globe. But I was also struck in that exhibition that only one of the objects, or set of the objects, actually made it into the environment itself. And I was really struck by this installation by Jennifer Mccurdy, because in many ways this is quotes the happenstance of finding bleached bones from various animals and fish on these beaches in ways that they are also sculptural objects, but ones that are left there in a very different kind of way. I also want to note that the kinds of interventions in making waves have cognates elsewhere. And this is a project that is in process off the coast of North Carolina, where they are trying to repopulate the area with native oysters. And to do this, oysters need to have something to set to or to strike to. An oyster is a reef animal, so it needs something to build on. And so they put together these giant sea creatures and synchronized swimmers in concrete that then inhabit the bottom. And you can imagine being the kayaker who encounters the figure on the left. This could be a disturbing and traumatic moment for somebody that didn't quite know what they were looking at. But to answer Emily's question, is the book A South You Never Ate really grew out of conversations and collaborations. The area where I've been working, this long, narrow peninsula, and I think you can see my cursor. I live right there on that little piece right there, is the county in Virginia with the longest history of persistent poverty. The average household income here is $27,000 thereabouts. That's with everybody working. And it has suffered population decline every single census since 1930. So you start to think about a population that was at over 18,000 in 1930 and is now, I think, closing in on 9,000 and forecast to drop even further. So this is an area that is really troubled and also extraordinarily beautiful, and an area which has seen folks coming together around the harvesting, cultivation, processing of foods for thousands of years, and that the three big strains that emerged early on were First Peoples, Euro-Americans, and African-Americans. That has now been supplemented by Latinx people. The project began around a conversation where 5 folks in the community came together, and we formed a little group called Eastern Shore Virginia Foodways with the mission of one job for one person, so one family does not have to leave. And each of us has our own skills. Two folks are oyster growers, commercial oyster growers and clam growers. One is a vintner, and then the other is a chef, a trained chef. And my job in all of this is to collect voice and to sort of begin to create a kind of awareness around this place, as awareness would translate into desire. But I wanted to do it in the voice of the place, which is why it's got so many quotes from people here, because they're not my stories, they're the stories of the people who live here. And the other thing was that folks here really don't think too much about the heritage of their foodways. And so there is sort of also the question of raising a kind of local consciousness around what was happening. So that's really how it began. But then the big questions become how to go ahead and frame this. And this was around the question of terroir. And terroir, in the limited French sense, it's actually a legal designation that is that translates into the taste of place, the character of place, and is used as a kind of assessment of distinction, most notably associated with wines, cheeses, and some sausages and other dishes. But it's more than that, because in fact, if terroir is the taste of place, the only way you can understand terroir is to consume it and literally make it part of your body. And that really opens up some very interesting possibilities. So what Emily wanted me to do was to say a little bit about craft ecologies, what are craft ecologies, and what is the place and work of the object within these ecologies. So I'll do that. And then to talk a little bit about oysters in particular as made things. You know, yes, they're an animal, but they are constructed in very particular ways. And they're not constructed in ways that are about genetic modification. They are constructed in ways that require intensive handwork and real knowledge of medium and the skill to work in that medium, as well as the aesthetic or artistic sensibility that enables the growers to actually place these in marketplaces for consumers. So, after I sort of do that part, then if there's time, I could read a little passage out of the book, or we could just get into it for conversation. Emily has promised to keep me under control, and I am grateful for that. So, an ecology, let's just start with an ecology, is a complex network of interactions between organisms and their environments. That's what we think of as an ecology. An environment is, in essence, the physical address for any defined set of those relationships. So the ecology, if the ecology is the system of relationships, then they have to occur within a context, a physical context, which is the environment. What should come to mind immediately is the idea is that an ecology is a cultural and social construction. They are not out there, just simply out there. They are things that we recognize and curate through acts of perception, and how we go about describing the natural worlds that we inhabit. You cannot have ecologies without some sort of human presence, whether it's analytical or physical. It's just, there's no way to do it. They are, in fact, these cultural and social constructions. A craft ecology highlights the work around the making of things and the ways in which made things negotiate or are used to negotiate, navigate, and need to get a nautical word in there, navigate and mediate those interactions within these systems of relationships, sometimes rhetorically and aesthetically, as in making waves, but almost always instrumentally, is that they do work, not the work of utility. I'm not thinking about instrumentality in the limited sense of utility, but rather a broader spectrum of work. Now, terroir from food studies describes a particular way in which we know, ingest, and describe ecology, and it extends to the universe of craft. A critical element in a more generous iteration of terroir is the recognition that we consume place and make it part of ourselves, or we consume craft, even in the simple act of looking, and in that engagement, make it part of ourselves. This is what we do as people. One of the ways to think about this is that the object, certain objects, and not all objects potentially have this possibility, but no object has this possibility all the time. And this is what I think of as the lyric instant. This is the moment when we encounter something and are brought into its presence in a particular way that just sort of leaves us amazed. You can all think of an object where you've had that experience, I'm sure. The other part of that, though, is because humans, one of the fundamental things about being human is narrative. We are creatures that cannot operate without making sense of the worlds we inhabit. And so terroir is part of this sense-making process. It's a narrative process. It's something that is, it can be descriptive, it can be explanatory, it can be philosophical, but the fact of the matter is that we go from this moment of lyric engagement immediately, almost instantaneously, into this kind of narrative sense-making. The other thing is about terroir is that because it is about consumption of place and making it part of ourselves, it requires the possession of contextually specific knowledge. The knowledge that we associate with discernment is that in order to engage terroir, we need to have the social and cultural capital of discernment and bring it to bear on whatever it is that we are looking at, whether it's Mccurdy's installation by the seashore or this group of wild oysters that I actually picked up off the edge of my working dock. The other elements, pardon? Oh, okay, oh, very good. All right, the other parts of this, and I'll be done with this part of it, is that it's important to think about these things as made things. You need to think about these environments and ecologies as in constant motion. They are constantly evolving, altering over time. And they are also, when we stop and ask the simple question of why does this look the way it does, we have engaged the question right there of making, of why, whether it's making through natural forces or through human intervention. So let's go through making an oyster. Emily, please keep me on track here and on time. I don't know how many.
Sorry. I just want to mention for everyone, we would encourage you to either put your questions in chat, or when Bernie concludes with the presentation, then we'll open up and have a more live conversation as well. So either option is great.
Great. Okay, and I'm going to be quick about this part here. But oysters seem to be having a renaissance these days. Manhattan wants to put a few billion off of the island to mitigate future Hurricane Sandys. It's a thought. But oysters have been part of the human diet from time immemorial. And among the earliest recorded oyster growing enterprises were those by the Romans at Ostia, where they developed a strategy for bundling sticks, sinking them in the still saline waters, and getting oysters to recruit to them. There's this whole language. I may have to explain all the language at some point, but what I want to do is show you what we see here. So I'm going to focus today on my friend and neighbor, Tom Gallivan's Shooting Point Oysters. And Tom is a medium grower. He grows about 7 million a year. Now, that number is important because those 7 million oysters are handled individually multiple times over the course of their 24-month lifespan. And it all involves at some point handwork, or where machines are involved, they're minimal. There's just no way that you can do this other than by handwork. So this is not his packing house, but this is his processing house that you see at the center of the screen. And then on the right is you have a James Beard Award-winning chef, Jeremiah Langhorne, who is looking at oysters that are about to be culled or separated or sorted through. I include Jeremiah here because part of our work is in making chefs like Jeremiah, Spike Mccurdy of Woodbury Kitchen, Andrea Rusing of Lantern, but high-profile chefs in the Southeast aware of what these oysters are about. So meet Tom Gallivan. He looked like this just yesterday when I went over there. And what you see in Tom's hand, a hand that was never intended to be that of a hand model, I can add, is that he is going to take the little oyster that you see between thumb and forefinger and grow it out to a market oyster, which will be slightly lower than the oyster that you see down in the palm of his hand. Now, to do this is that, we always think about oysters and the taste of the sea, and this is a wonderfully natural thing. No, this is a curated thing, and it is a crafted thing. So where does this start is the oysters that you see in the hands here are what are called seed oysters. To get to that, you have to begin with oysters that are invisible to the human eye. You can see them under a microscope, and they have to be fed on these filtered, naturally cultured alga. So part of this begins with harvesting alga from these native waters, taking out any pollutants, using this filtered material that runs through these tanks. Each one of these contains a couple of thousand of oysters. They're set out in these bins. All of this is handmade. This is all put together so that what you've got is not just the oyster as a craft object, you have the entire infrastructure because it is so specialized that it is all made in that way. Now, the trick to get here is how do you get from a bin of oysters like this in the center to oysters that you see in a restaurant or on a menu. And so what I'm going to do is to walk you through from seed all the way out to culling, planting, sacking, and to the table. So the first thing is, once they're out of what are called upwellers and downwellers, and the oysters are the size of the one that was pressed between Tom's thumb and forefinger, they are then screened and they are carried to a sieving table. So here's the unloading of the oysters. Meanwhile, on the other side of the room, Tom's crew is preparing these mesh bags. These are for planting oysters. So we're talking about something that's kind of like agriculture. Well, it is called aquaculture. So here you see this making of the bags. And then Tom here is loading the bags. Now, when he dips that plastic cup down into that pile of what looks like gravel, each time he picks it up, he is picking up 7,000 oysters and placing them in a bag. So now you know what 7,000 baby oysters look like. Okay, now, back one. So the next set is that once those are there, those will be carried out in those sacks onto the oyster grounds. And the oyster grounds are either owned or leased from the state of Virginia. So I lease 5 acres and my lease cost me $7 a year. It's the best rent I ever paid. In this, $7, why bother? But anyway, so what you've got now are those little oysters, and they'll be taken out to start to grow on the Chesapeake Bay side, which has lower salinity. The lower salinity encourages the oysters to grow more quickly because it will take an oyster in the wild up to 2.5 to 3 years to grow to the regulation 3-inch size. And it'll be a very irregular shaped animal. To make this work, the oysters that are grown commercially through this system have to be brought to maturity between 18 and 22 to 24 months. So, I mean, you are really pushing this. So you want to put them in waters with lower salinity that encourage them to grow faster. At some point, those oysters are then trucked the 4 miles across that narrow peninsula, loaded onto yet another fleet of work boats, and taken out and dropped in the Atlantic waters. More on that in a moment. Meanwhile, back in the packing house, oysters that have grown from those little seed, and these are oysters that have already been handled multiple times, are brought in, hosed off, and then poured into this hopper. When they're in that hopper, they then take an escalator ride, and they're going up. colony. And they are going into that long stainless steel tube or a tumbler. And think about rock tumbling, or how you would tumble for gemstones to polish them up. And what's happening here is, you'll see, now those oysters that you see in that basket will be picked through by hand. They will be culled for shape, for size, irregularity. They will be individually cleaned with a hammer called a culling hammer to get any oysters that are attaching themselves to the oyster for market off of them. Remember, it's a reef animal. It grows like coral. It amasses in an organic system of these animals. And what you're trying to do is create animals, grow animals in a way that has nothing to do with their natural predilection. The only time you find single oysters, other than on a plate, is where they have been washed out in a storm or something along those lines. So part of this is getting these things that naturally clump together, or what we call wrap up, and to take on this appearance of the individual oysters. They are then taken back out on a working barge like this. And you can see that these waters are shallow. They are placed in these trays, and these trays are laid out in this very dynamic tidal area on the bay side, the low salinity side. They are periodically picked up. They're not always brought in. Sometimes they are hosed out. They're hoisted into the workboat and hosed out on board with selective culling to get to oysters that are close to what you need for market. Once you're at this point of oysters ready by size and shape, is you have to go the next thing. And I just want y'all to think how much work there is involved in this. Is they are then loaded onto boats like this, and this is in the winter, and we go out on the seaside. Now we're on the Atlantic side as opposed to the Chesapeake Bay side. And on the Atlantic side, the waters that are used for growing are designated as a UN coastal reserve. These are the cleanest waters left in the eastern United States. And they are a prime area for aquaculture, specifically clam cultivation and oyster cultivation. This is in fact the largest commercial clam ground on the planet. But that's another story. It's all how clams are made as opposed to how clams are grown. In any case, they go into the water and they are finished because now they become saltier. It's a process. You can pull it off in as little as 48 hours. It's best to leave them in salt water for a couple of weeks. An oyster is a liquid animal. It filters roughly 50 gallons of seawater a day. These are also one of the few forms of cultivation or human intervention which actually make the environment cleaner than when you began. Because if you think about one oyster filtering 50 gallons of seawater a day, then you start to think about Tom with just his measly 7 million times 50 gallons a day. And then all the other growers who are out here, is you were talking about actually having significant localized positive impacts in terms of water clarity and quality. Meanwhile, as what's happening there happens in different ways around the globe. Here in Cancale, France, a place known for its oysters, there's a system that is also the mix of hand culling that you see down here on the lower left as they work through oysters that are grown in bags, in a rack and bag system that are then put on these pallets. The pallets are then brought in. They go through these culling machinery, this process. They're in their baskets. And then in this area, you can see in the lower center, this is actually an indoor pool for oysters. I kid you not, because they have to keep these oysters in these pools long enough for them to remove or expel any of the pollutants that are in these Normandy and Brittany waters, and which are an issue, which is an issue we don't have. Then they are packaged for the market and off they go to their domain. So this is how you get from this to this to this. And this third one, the shucked oyster, raises a question then of other kinds of interventions and other kinds of objects. The oysters that you see here in Tom's hands end up in restaurants and trays and preparations, for example, what that you see here. The wild stuff looks like this along the marsh banks. These are oysters that are not nicely fan-shaped and rounded on the underside or the cup. These things are long and snipey and are all locked up together in these reef-like formations. These are not harvested. These are just left alone because this is where the aesthetic can be controlled and where the craft can be fully developed. This brings you to the quayside or into the fish market. And here in Cancale is, you see an oystermonger, all these different kinds of oysters. All the oysters on the eastern seaboard, from the Gulf Coast to Prince Edward Island, it's the same species. It's all Crassostrea virginica. All the oysters in the coastal waters of France, almost all, there's still some native Ballons or Austria edulis, but all the oysters that are farmed, like these that you see here, are Crassostrea angulata. And they are the third wave of imported oyster strains brought into these areas. But they're all marketed separately. And the reason is part of the craft is in a broader sensorium than the eye, is how do these things taste? Making the oyster as an object is all about the eye eats first, is creating a kind of visual desire. When you get into this point is now you're talking about places with different flavor profiles. To get to that is one of the things that we did is here is that all of the creeks on the Chesapeake side taste different. And every couple of years, I'll get together with a half dozen or 10 of commercial growers and we'll blind taste test oysters and judge them on the basis of salinity. And a common comment, because everybody knows their oysters are the best to begin with, that's just how it is. Why would your oysters be worse than somebody else's? But the best part is, oh, you're growing these near the water treatment plant, or something along those lines. There's a whole world of argument there. But the other part of this are the shucking houses. When we buy oysters in jars that are already shucked, those things cannot be opened mechanically. That is all handwork, certainly on the eastern seaboard. And as oysters have come back, is that folks who are skilled in the craft of shucking, and here they're shucking wild oysters, Steve Bunce's, have become an increasing demand. The reason I bring this up with people like H.M. Arnold, who's just down the hill from Tom's Oyster Sheds, is there are other objects of intervention. And one of the things to think about, say, for example, oyster knives. Here are 6 oyster knives. On the left is one just hammered out of bar steel, and this is called a cracker. And you break off the bill of the oyster and then get it with this end. It's pretty messy work. These are a couple of homemade ones, my favorite being out of a dinner knife. And then these are the 3 that I use. And everybody I know who shucks oysters has an array of knives that are suited to the ecology. They're part of the ecology of these animals. That on top is the Murphy knife, is a Duxbury stabber. It's a broader blade. It's good if you are going to hinge shuck an oyster, which would be a natural oyster, an oyster with a heavier shell. The one on the bottom is with a rosewood handle, is a French oyster knife that has the advantage of having a wedge-like profile so that you can actually use it in terms of a different alternative, more means of leverage. And then the one in the center, which is one I use a lot, is a half-length Chesapeake stabber, which is suited for this environment. It's suited for these animals. The Duxbury stabber is suited for the animals of Massachusetts Bay. The French one is suitable for the oysters of Concal. What you begin to see is the way in which these objects get introduced into the conversation, and they are also made things. They are tools that mediate our relationship between the animal and the ingredient or the commodity, so that you get into these things with things like commodity flows. So one of the byproducts you get out of all this in a shucking house are a lot of shells. And if you have, and they're sharp as razors, but if you have particularly tough kids in an area that gets no snow, they will use oyster seed bags for toboggans and sled down these mounds of shell. Meanwhile, the chicken's busy at the bottom. So this part of this knife is every oyster shucker has favored knives. As they convert the animal to ingredient or to delicacy. And what this has given rise to in places like New Orleans or any place there's a raw bar is oyster theater. Is that the oysters then become a medium in a performative art, which is how do you pick this thing up and and get into it and open it up so that when it's put out on its bed of ice, it is attractive to the eye when it eats a second time. So you start with these cupped oysters, you get them open, and you can see just how beautifully these are done. This is not easy. You really have to have worked through a few thousand oysters to begin to get a handle on this. So you get all of that, and then part of oyster theater then are these things like lectures and presentations, in which all the information that I've given you is presented as a way, that narrative, that moving from that lyric moment into that narrative moment of sense making, where we are now seeing the oyster through connoisseurship, discernment, positioned for consumption. Now, I know it's almost lunchtime on some coasts.
That's right. Coming up on ours, certainly.
Okay, so let me stop share.
Thank you. Okay, great. Fascinating to get more in-depth sense beyond, what you presented in the book, certainly. And I also just want to mention, and I'm sure many of you who've looked at the book, that this is just one aspect of the book. There are chapters on so many more parts of the culinary history and culture of the Eastern Shore of Virginia that there's so much that we could tap into here. And so for anyone who would like to jump in with questions, please, by all means, let us know, or if you're more comfortable, and turn your cameras on, your mics on, of course, and or type into the chat. But so let's see, I think what is partially so interesting about oysters and other types of seafood is, yes, how you've identified this approach to this entire ecology, and that is unique to that subset to have this number of implements, this performative aspect that involves both the maker and the consumer, the eater, is really very special. But I think it also would be great to talk about how, because your book is also very much about loss of craft cultures and loss of culture overall over time. And I'm curious how that shift has happened in terms of oyster cultivation in that community. What might have changed over time, and are you, in the sense, documenting this moment that 25 years from now it will definitely be a South people never ate? It's true now, but
you're right about elements of it, but I don't think of it in terms of loss. I think of it all in terms of change. And change is constant. It's always changing. It's always been changing. Our court records in this particular county are the oldest continuous records in the United States. And 1632. And in 1633, we already see loss of indigenous foodways through the introductions of pigs, cows, and fruit trees. All of these non-native things. And so I guess you reach a point where you can look back and reconstruct it as loss. And a lot of people think of tradition that way, but tradition is better understood, I think, as the cultural process of making sense. And so tradition is always about invention and innovation. So that as people engage media, they engage making, they do so in ways that look over a universe of made or said or performed things, but then synthesize it into a single act and project it forward. And the aggregation of all those acts then becomes a repertoire for continuing change. So I never thought of it as loss when I was doing the work. One way is to think about this kind of work is, especially this work, is I don't chase the past, I chase the present. And I'm just trying to get those voices down so that those reference points for how people know themselves are there for the future.
Lisa,
Yeah, exactly. We have a question in the chat from Lisa. Go for it.
Yes, I am here in Northern California. I grew up with the tradition that you only eat oysters in a month with an R in it. I can explain that to in magnificent detail. It has everything to do with oyster reproduction in the wild. Oysters are what are called broadcast spawners. And what this means is that in the reef, the male puts out all of its genetic material, the female puts out all of its genetic material, and then it somehow collides in the tide. They are putting so much energy into that procreative endeavor that if you open a wild oyster in the summer, it will be thin and watery. Now, there are also certain naturally occurring pathogens in the water column that for people with significant immune deficiency issues that could factor in. But the real reason is it's the reproductive season when oysters are at their least delectable. Part of the grail of oyster culture now has been to the development of oysters that in this process are shocked out of their reproductive cycle. And these are called triploids. Reproductive oysters are called diploids, but triploids just put everything, every second of every day into growing. And that's one of the ways they're able to push those oysters to size in those compressed time frames. So thanks for that, Lisa. That's a great question. Nicole, within the realm of ecology, is there anything useful that the local community can do with the oyster shells once they've been shucked? Yes, the most useful thing you can do with oyster shells is put them back in salt water so that oysters then have the basis for reef building. We suffered huge, where I am right now, is our sea level rise, which everybody's experiencing, are compounded. This is one of the areas for the most intense sea level rise, and our land is sinking at the same time. So we're sort of two ends running toward an unhappy middle. Part of that has been accelerated shoreline erosion, which buries oysters. Whole oyster beds were knocked out or disappeared under silt over a period of about 40 to 50 years. And so now what we're doing is using that shell, which is called culch, as the substrate or the bed for recruiting, that is to get those little fertilized oyster larvae to strike, which means to land on, and set, which means to adhere, and begin to grow back these native oyster reefs, which will not be harvested. So yes, the most important thing you can do is to recycle them into the environment. If you can't do that,
I'm sorry. Along those lines, in terms of the, that's incredible how much filtration they're able to serve. So what about pollution, and how is that impacting them? And then how is it impacting us in terms of consuming what them?
Good question. All oysters have to be tagged by location, by law, on the date of harvest and where they came from. And the restaurant or wherever you get them has to have that information, and you can ask for it. Yeah, and you should. But the environments are microenvironments, and so you really have to be pretty sure about where things come from. But they are filter feeders, and they do what they do is they consolidate those sorts of pollutants in what are called pseudo feces, which is like a very fine grained mud, which pushes out around the oysters, so that if they're coming out of clean waters, they're really good. But there are other things that have been in play, and I want to come back to Lisa's question on the north. And actually on Nicole's question about these oysters, is that up in the northwest coast, even further up, is there has been we wouldn't perceive it, but there's been a rise in the salinity, in the acidity of seawater northwest coast, which has made those oysters, their shells are essentially lime, calcium carbonate. And if you put acid on calcium carbonate, it dissolves. And so it's made it very difficult for oysters to reproduce naturally in the Northwest coast. Some growers, I understand, have actually taken to exporting those larval oysters to Hawaii to get them to a size that they can resist being dissolved by, that rise in acidity.
What about temperature change?
Pardon?
Temperature changes as well? Does that impact things?
They can resist incredible amount of temperature change, certainly on the East Coast. They can freeze as hard as a popsicle 2 or 3 times in a winter. And if you don't touch them, they will thaw out and just go right along being oysters. But if you mess with them, it'll kill them. And they can withstand water temperatures that we get in really shallow, super hot days of about 110 degrees. So they're resistant to temperature, but the things like pH levels are a significant issue. And also, an oyster has no friends. And once they have made the decision to stay where they're going to stay, when they set, they never move again in their lifetime unless they're washed out or harvested. Am I familiar with the oyster farming in Baja California? If so, do the methods parallel those you described on your Virginia Craft oyster farm? I don't know that oyster cultivation, but if they are doing things like finishing oysters or starting oysters on one side of Baja and then carrying them over to the other side, then they're doing something similar. But I just don't know that. I am aware of some of the conflicts around the interactions with the National Park Service and traditional oyster growers, and the Park Service wanting folks to stop growing because they see it as a destructive intervention, when in fact that is not the case. Are there other questions? I see Jen Van Horn. Hi, Jen.
Hi, Jen. I wonder what what you could say briefly in terms of overfishing is something that you talk about throughout the book, and how that shift has impacted that region on every level. So even beyond oysters, I mean, and it really is, again, that idea of an ecology that I think is so brilliant that you've identified, how there's so many different people involved, let alone objects and artifacts and implements and tools and systems and processes. Yeah, overfishing over time, what that's meant to the Eastern Shore.
Well, there's no question that we're seeing a significant species decline, and that it has intensified really over the last 50 years. And one of the issues, I mean, there's overfishing, but people tend to overfish by species and then find another species to overfish. One of my favorite examples, and I'm not going to take time to go find this video clip, is the pound fishermen off the barrier islands here would catch huge boatloads of ocean perch. And in those, they would catch monkfish. And there's this footage taken in the late 30s of them walking on the deck of the Monitor and kicking the monkfish back into the ocean. Because there was no market for it. And so what you get is it's a succession of species that fish out the market. Then you have unregulated species. So part of it's a policy issue. There is no holistic approach that I know of that addresses the broader array of interactions between species. So they put a moratorium on fishing for commercial fishing for striped bass or rockfish. That population grew. It's a predatory population. And it started eating all the smaller fish. And now they've got to worry about the smaller fish. And meanwhile, the most important of those fish is the menhaden, which until recently have been fished using spotter planes and wiping out entire populations. But it's not unique to us. That is a global issue. And you need to be aware that there's an inshore fishery and there's an offshore fishery. The offshore fishery falls under international law and treaties. And the inshore fishery falls under national and local, state, or provincial governance. But one of the problems is that without the reconciliation of those two, you have the end of cod fishing in Outport, Newfoundland, and in that case, the loss of whole communities because the resource has been overfished. So complicated. It's a complicated problem. If I could fix it, I'd probably be asked to give a TED talk.
Well, it seems like, the steps that you're taking as far as refocusing on oyster cultivation and, what you discussed in the book in terms of others that are in small scale farming and kind of reinventing and reinvigorating the species is a step towards that. So, yeah. Let's see.
Jen has a question.
Go ahead.
Here, I think I have to ask to unmute you and then you're good.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you so much. This was absolutely enjoyable. I guess my question is taking us a little bit back to the very first concept of craft ecology. And I was really interested in the ways that craft ecologies, I guess I was interested in the question of whether they apply to any crafted object or to what extent craft ecology really is helpful in thinking about natural or living organisms. Because I was just struck by the ways that this process that you outlined, it's really defined by these vast transformations in scale that seem really distinctive, right? That you go from these little tiny microscopic organisms to much bigger ones, or even like oceanic scale, right? Like the ocean itself becomes a kind of maker as a part of this process. So I guess I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about craft ecology in the sense of, does that apply to any crafted object, or is that particularly helpful if we're thinking about living organisms?
Well, they are different. Thanks for asking that, Jen. I'm still in sort of early stages in sorting this, but if asked today, I would say it applies to any object. And it's because any object enters into a system of relationships. As soon as you see it, it's entered in, and you make sense of it in your mind, it's entered into those relationships. And so to think about that in ecological terms, as then, what constitutes its environment. And I think of ecology as much more than context. I think that it is carries a kind of dynamism with it that is not present in the ways in which we've historically talked about context. So, I think we might say that environment could be analogous to context, but what ecology does is it frees us up to look not so much at the thing, one thing and another thing, but at the space between things. It opens up. You cannot have an ecology without the dynamics of interstitiality, the in-betweenness of things. And I think that that's true for everything, for all kinds of objects. I wish I'd brought in an oyster knife with me, but it's true for everything from iPhones. I mean, think of the iPhones, how those things operate, or things that are considerably more rarefied. For example, the objects in the exhibition behind Emily that are there, or this is where it's great to see people's things. But it's that's what it's about. It's about that. It's about how those things operate as systems. And the notion and the understanding, and I think this is where sort of environmental policy gets off track, is we assume, and policy assumes, that somehow ecologies are a given, and they're not. They are things that can only be understood as constructions.
I think also about, I do absolutely agree that you're this root of an idea that I hope is going to go forward in a bigger way of craft ecologies. I think it's so applicable to so many kinds of objects. Even, I'm thinking about quilts, because you've done so much work on quilts, and how those are born from ecologies. Looking at your footage made me think more about ceramics. Go figure, all the dirt and all of that, but all of the raw materials that engage people and all sorts of factors, and then the stages that it goes through in terms of the development of an object, and quilts certainly being more of a collective process in certain cases, and not always, but I think it's a really interesting way to approach craft overall. So not sure if we have any more questions.
Catherine.
Oh, wait, there's a
Hi,
question.
Bernie. Hi, everyone. Bernie, I enjoyed this so much. And there's always so much to think about listening to you talk. And we've talked about oysters before in your work here, and it's just so revelatory. And one thing I was thinking about, you have done this interview for the Bard Graduate Center Craft Art Design Oral History Project, which will go up this summer, I promise. And what was really interesting about that was there's a lot of things I didn't know about your family in that region and your connection to that region. I think you've talked a little bit in the book about your connection, to the subject matter. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, if you're comfortable about those personal connections.
Yeah, I'm not from here, but I've lived here off and on since, now you're going to know how old I am, since I was a little kid in the early 1950s, and have always kept our connection here. We lived here for a few years, then we moved across the bay to Norfolk, which is where I went to school. But then came back for a bit, got married here, so that my connections here are intermittent, but they are over a lifetime. And people here have been accused of making a distinction between folks that are from here, folks who are from away, and folks who have come back. And somehow I've been honorarily inducted into the group of people who've come back. And the funniest moment, I hadn't been here in 25 years, and we bought a house and they published the property transactions in the paper. And I got an email the next morning that said, "We see you're coming back." It's that kind of place. So I don't know if that's what you wanted, but you know, my family is that, I mean, I'm happy to tell you some of it is that when we were here in the 50s, even though we have never been practicing, is that we were the only Jewish family in our half of the county. And somehow somebody found out, which was fine. But, you know, coming up is that one of my favorite memories, which just horrified my mother, was when the kids down the lane at the next farm over felt our heads to see if it was true we had horns. And we were so disappointed. We didn't have them. So it's that kind of place. It's, you know, but it's a place like a whole lot of other places, except for in the details.
And are the details what made you come back? What made you come back?
Well, everybody has, I imagine, some sort of sense of a home place. And our family was part of the Jewish diaspora from the mid-19th century on. And my sister and I are the first members of our family that somebody has not actively tried to kill. And so, you know, all of a sudden you're in this sort of place and you have no other place. And it's a place where you're accepted for who you are. There are no eccentrics here. It's one of my favorite things about this place. An eccentric, it's a relational category. You can't have any eccentrics if everybody's eccentric. And that's how this place works. And I really love that.
You convey that so strongly and well, and make it so engaging in terms of this book. Absolutely comes through so well. You have another question about Indigenous communities. I don't know if Nicole wants to ask. I don't see her.
Oh, she's right there. I see her. But are you aware of any history of local Indigenous communities in that area of Virginia having grown and harvested oysters? And if so, do you know of any sort of redress for any applicable loss of their historical oyster farming, or any communities who may have maintained their farming traditions? From everything I've read, and I've read all of the county court records from 1632 to 1710, people were harvesting wild oysters, and they were in abundance. There was no necessity to farm these things at all. There were no markets for them at that point. The oyster markets, as we begin to understand them, really don't emerge here until the mid-19th century. So that it's a much larger question of the loss of indigenous lands and access to the lands. The challenge there is there are no recognized indigenous groups here. And the presence of indigenous peoples really is not manifest in the population, self-identifying or through external identification until you get up to the southeastern corner of Delaware and the northeastern corner of the eastern shore of Maryland, where you have the Nanticokes, the Nanticoke people. And I believe that they are still not recognized as a group. So, Nicole, I am very sad to say is that the answer to the question is a lamentable no.
Well, clearly everyone would love to continue on and on. We don't want to keep you all day, although we would like that. But I wonder if you have a closing recipe tip for us heading into the weekend.
Okay, have I got a recipe for you? So I sort of mentioned, I can't remember who I mentioned this, but I think it was just to you and Joan, was that I got onto this thing where I found an article that was published in around 1900 that listed 100 oyster recipes by name, but no recipes. So I thought, how hard can this be? Especially if you have a research assistant who is interested in this. So I set Katie Clune on the task, and I'll be darned if she didn't find 99 of those. And I thought that was amazing. And then she presented me with the other 650 that she'd come up. So we sort of have like now 649 or 749 oyster recipes. So I've been working through them in a vague kind of way and experimenting with different ones. When you have no shortage of oysters, this is not a problem. And my friends, the commercial growers, are always happy to throw 400 or 500 at some sort of insanity that I've dreamt up. This is a good problem to have. And unless you have shellfish allergy, that's not a very good problem. But the favorite recipe, and this is one to know, is that it's for a variation on a panned oyster, which is an oyster that is not broiled but cooked on high heat in a stovetop oven. Get shucked oysters. Saltier, the better. If they're really salty oysters, you're in good shape. Get as many as you can get a hold of. I usually use a pint of oysters, which runs about, about 2 dozen oysters in their own liquor, will serve easily a dinner for 4 or supper for 4. Usually I'll go for 2 jars and do, roughly 50 oysters. But in any case, you take those oysters and you pour them out into a strainer and save the liquid in a bowl underneath. Meanwhile, take a pan, take butter. So far, how can you go wrong? Oysters and butter. I mean, this is working. And you butter a saucier or a shallow oven top pan thoroughly with the butter. Save the butter. Be sure to lick your fingers. And then you lay the oysters in that pan. And you meanwhile have taken the oyster liquor, depends how much there are, but usually I'll add a half cup to 3/4 of a cup of a dry white wine to that and whisk it together. You put the oysters on top of the stove, until on a medium heat until their gills start to wrinkle a little bit. You then add the liquid to the pan. You then put pats of butter on top of the oysters, and you can put in a little cayenne if you want, and you put it in the oven for, the oven is set at like 400 degrees for 4 or 5 minutes. You take it out, and you have on the side is red paprika or cayenne or something, something like that for a little bit of color and flavor. And then what you can do is you can lay out all your bowls. Everybody can get like 6 oysters and everybody gets it. But it's the perfect thing for a dinner where you're trying to do things by portions. And it's incredibly fast to make. I was working with a chef who was hosting a dinner, and she ran into the problem of what shall we say, an equipment failure, and needed something in a hurry. And she just happened to have a gallon of shucked oysters. Got to have these things for emergency. And so I did this for a dinner for 35 and 15 minutes. There I got to use things like hotel pans and things like that. But we do that small version all the time through the winter. There's another great one with Madeira, but I'll save that some other occasion.
Okay, next time, definitely. Maybe when we get to eels and crabs, which we.
Hi, Elizabeth. Yeah, sorry, I'm waving to people I know. I see Melissa's name and John's name. This is cool, the stalwarts, but I'm happy to meet the new folks I've never seen before.
Anyways, Melissa says hi. Wow. I just think it's incredible, your depth of knowledge. I mean, just to begin, that you're not an environmental scientist. You're coming from a totally different perspective and field, and that you just have such an amazing range of knowledge, and that it's so deep. So thank you. And you're an incredible storyteller. Obviously, you have the most distinct voice. Reading through these pages, it's, hearing you right there. So I hope you'll do much more in terms of foodways. We all want to come for oysters, obviously, now. So we'll be there. I'll bring the Madeira.
You're always welcome. And just so you know, I always keep roughly 5,000 or 6,000 on hand for culinary emergencies.
There's only 17 of us, so we're set.
From
Okay.
Leslie, are the oysters on the stove top cooked in the liquid oyster liquor plus wine before putting in 400-degree oven? No, they're just lightly cooked in the butter. You can put in a little liquid if you want it, because you don't want them to brown. You just want them to wrinkle enough. And you don't have to, pardon?
Sorry, is this anywhere in the book by any chance?
Yeah, actually, it's the recipe that I contributed to the book that's in here. The Madeira recipe is not, but there are others. Actually, just as sort of a footnote, is that during the pandemic, think about this for a minute. During the pandemic, all the raw bars closed, all the restaurants closed. I have acquaintances in the business whose business dropped, and I am not exaggerating, 95%. Now, think about this for a minute. They had saved, and it's working, any sort of agriculture, you just got to save for a bad situation, like an oil tanker running aground and killing everything. But you think about this. So there they are, and you saw how labor intensive that process is. The optimal size for a raw bar is an oyster that is small now. It's 2.5 to 3 inches. You take an oyster that in a down market where nobody's buying oysters, and all of a sudden they're growing 3.5, 4 inches, 4.5 inches. And those things are now no longer desirable for the most value enhanced part of the market. So I sort of thought about this, and I thought about jobs for people and figured out how to smoke oysters and preserve them, pasteurize them and preserve them. And so now I'm giving the entire process away to a grower, because the idea is now it creates work in down markets and in down seasons, so that folks who are further, who are really on doing that kind of hourly work would have another opportunity for labor. So that's my current project, which has involved smoking so far thousands of oysters and putting up and doing all of this in our kitchen, which has gained me no fan club.
We love it. Amazing. Yeah. Yeah. It's the creative economy at work, just with consumable. Well, thank you.
Haven't been to your site. Folks haven't been to see the Making Waves site. You got to go. The objects in the portfolio are really cool.
Thank you. So good to hear. Well, thanks everybody for being here. So nice to see you all. Thank you so much, Bernie. Amazing to get this in-depth look.